Thank you for joining me today to talk about telephony and Teams. The idea with this talk is over the next half an hour or so to have a little look through the options for how to get telephony working in a Teams tenant. So the sections we're going to talk about is a little bit of background setting for what I mean by calling versus telephony, a little bit about calling plans, a little bit about direct routing, and some stuff about the approach to take when you're looking to roll this out. So first up is calling versus telephony, just to kind of set the basics really, if you like, because with Teams, you can be making a call from your PC or a user logged in on a mobile device or someone sat in a meeting room, assuming that it's a Teams compatible device or that there is a compatible device in that room. And the person on the other end of that call can either be, again, someone on a PC, someone on a mobile device, or someone in another meeting room. Those things are all calling. But when we mean telephony, that's when we're doing a call that ends outside of the Teams network. So it stops being a PC to PC or a network-based call, and at some point breaks out onto the real world to the PSTN network. And as well, we have the ability in Teams for people to be able to dial a phone number from the outside the Teams ecosystem and join a Teams meeting that's ongoing. So those are the elements that I mean by telephony. It's where we're dealing with something that is outside of the Teams environment and the Teams network. Everything else I kind of classify as calling, and that is where we're dealing with stuff that's from a Teams endpoint to a Teams endpoint or staying on an IP network of some description. So out of those two things of calling versus telephony, if we're focusing in on telephony, there's two items to consider. There's one is meetings, which is that scenario where you dial out from a meeting that is ongoing, or you dial in to a meeting that someone has scheduled. And then there's telephony, which is where you have users making or receiving normal phone calls, so kind of the traditional PBX style functionality. I don't have a huge amount of information on the meeting side of things because actually the choices are very limited here. You either have it turned on or you don't. That means that there is a license from Microsoft called the audio conferencing license. If you have that added to a user and they schedule a Teams meeting, then that Teams meeting will have dial-in credentials or coordinates included in the invitation. You do have a few choices about whether you use the global set of shared numbers that Microsoft provide, or whether you want to add custom numbers in particular locations or regions, or things like toll or toll-free numbers, but there are no choices for providers or how you go about implementing that. It's effectively you either have it or you don't. Telephony, on the other hand, there are a couple of choices, which is what we're going to look at in a little bit more detail, which is calling plans or direct routing. Essentially, calling plans is where you take Microsoft to be your carrier, they're the provider of the PSTN service, or direct routing, which is where you bring your own SIP trunk to the Office 365 environment. So the first of those is calling plans. Calling plans, the main reason you would want to consider them is for convenience. You're already paying Microsoft for your Office 365 licensing bundle that gives you Teams, be that the enterprise plans or something else. Calling plans is another add-on that you take from Microsoft, and that allows you to give your users bundles of minutes. So there are three things to consider for calling plans. One is the countries, number two is the type of licensing that you provide, and three is you might have some issues around interop or where your numbers are coming from or whether you want to keep any existing numbers. For calling plans, these are the list of locations that Microsoft currently supports. So if you have users in these locations, you can assign telephone numbers to them from there. This doesn't mean that your tenant has to be created in those particular regions, just that a user has their region configured to one of those locations. Australia and Japan at the bottom of the list there have got little asterisks next to them because that's actually something that Microsoft don't provide directly themselves, but they have relationships with different partners in those regions. So in Australia, it's with Telstra, and in Japan, it's with SoftBank. At the moment, they do have a regional tenant restriction. So Australia, you have to have an Australia tenant to be able to do calling plans for Australian users. So it's not like if you had a US tenant with Australia users that you could take calling plans via Telstra. There are plans, I believe, to change that in future, but as things stand at the moment, you can only take advantage of that if you had the tenant created in that particular region. I think from a coverage point of view, Microsoft was being quite aggressive with the countries and locations that it was looking to add to calling plans, but that seems to have slowed down significantly in the last year. I don't think Microsoft are particularly pursuing new countries or new locations to add for calling plans. One question I've been asked by several customers who have calling plans or considering going for calling plans is whether that means Microsoft has a long-term commitment here, and whether it's something they should be worried about if calling plans might look at going away in the locations that are there. And I don't think that's true. Microsoft has quite big coverage from a dialing conferencing point of view, and obviously with previous acquisitions it's made with Skype and the like to have kind of PSTN connections and relationships in these countries. So all the work they've done with carriers in these countries and the regulations in these countries, I don't think there's much of a danger or a risk of those going away at any point soon. So the other aspect to consider here is licensing. So just starting with the ability to do PSTN calling at all, full stop, for a user, they have to have a phone system license assigned to them. A phone system license is what lets a user make and receive PSTN calls via any method, so be that calling plans or be that direct routing. Calling plans themselves are then the add-on license that let you have the Microsoft number, like I've said, but there are two choices essentially between the type of calling plan that you assign, and obviously there's associated costs with them, whether you have a domestic calling plan or a domestic and an international calling plan. So that means now, when you assign a calling plan license to a user, they get a bundle of minutes, and it's whether that bundle includes purely domestic numbers or the ability to dial international as well. They're split in two different categories. So there is a small, a medium, and a large, and the large is the version that comes in domestic and international as well. So for example, the small plan has 120 domestic minutes, the medium has 240, and the large is 1,200 domestic. And if you have the international version of that, 600 international minutes added on. That does also vary by region. So in the US, for example, the large plan is 3,000 minutes instead of 1,200. So, when we talk about planning and how to do these migrations, that is one of the things to consider. The other thing is that those licenses pool up as well. So if you had 10 users who had the large calling plan in your organization, what that actually means is you have 10 times the number of minutes available spread across those users. So if you have one user who makes a particularly large amount of calls in 1 month and is very lean the next, that balances out, or hopefully balances out across all of those. So the license types pool. The way they pool is by size, but also by geography. So users in the UK on a medium pot would pool, whereas someone in the US on a large plan would be in a different bundle, if you like, for those minutes. The other thing to consider when you're purchasing your licensing is just where you're buying your licenses from. It used to be that a Microsoft license with a Microsoft license. With the cloud services provider or CSP program, that is allowing resellers the option of bundling their own services on top of those license things. So stuff like doing service desk support, a quality of experience monthly reviews, or helping dig through and understand CQD, that sort of a thing. So that is worth considering where you're looking at purchasing your licensing, that whoever your LAR is might be able to offer value add services, or other partners might be able to add value add instead of just the plain licenses. From a number interop point of view, you essentially have two choices when you go for calling plans. Because you have no equipment on site and you're taking these services purely out of Office 365 Direct, if you have any numbers that you need to maintain when you migrate to Teams telephony, you have to port those to Microsoft. The porting process for numbers is traditionally not very easy, not very forgiving. It can be a bit of a challenge. My experience to date of porting to Microsoft excuse me, is that has been one of the smoothest so far. The team that they have doing this on the Microsoft side have been very helpful in the past when we've had issues with port requests not being accepted. They can generally help you identify what's wrong, and I'm sure some of the people on the line here might have experienced these types of issues where the process is you fill in a form that says who the losing carrier is, what the number range is, who the gaining carrier is, and there's a regulating body who goes and verifies this, puts the request in for the numbers to be moved, and if one piece of information is incorrect on the form, it usually just comes back as rejected. So that might be, that the numbers are actually listed as being held by Blue Yonder, who have gone through a bunch of name changes since. And again, Microsoft have been so far pretty helpful at helping untangle and unpick that stuff to get the numbers ported. The other option is that you take new numbers from your tenants, and you can do that if you go into the Teams admin console. You can go and select new numbers. When you pick new numbers, and this also applies when you're porting actually, there's two categories. There's either service numbers or user numbers. User numbers are what you are going to assign to your end users who you want to be able to make and receive calls, and service numbers are things that you are going to assign in one of three locations. So service number can either be specified to be a dial-in conference number that is unique to your tenant. So, if for example you had lots of users in Birmingham and they're used to having a Birmingham number that they dial for conferences, you might be able to go and request a service number to assign to your tenants to be a dial-in conference access number in Birmingham. The other two are using numbers to sit behind a call queue or an auto attendant, and those two things are what replicate some of the functionality of response groups that you used to have in on-premises environments or call flows from a traditional PBX. So an auto attendant lets you do things like in-hours versus out-of-hours routing, and then a call queue lets you pass calls through for either reception or a help desk or something like that, and route calls based on agent availability. That functionality is there. It can be a little bit limited depending on what your scenario is. It's not designed to replace kind of contact center level functionality at the moment, but there is, generally some things you can do there. So new numbers you can request from the portal and assign them into your tenant. The other thing when you're requesting new numbers for your users is generally if you go in and you say, I want user numbers, I want them in a specific location, and I want 30 of them, it will go and it will randomly select 30 numbers out of the pot that it has available. So don't expect to get a number numbers in a block. If you do, for any particular reason, need to get numbers in a block, then you can send a support request into Microsoft, and they will attempt to go and allocate you a number range to give out to your users. Just before we move on as well, porting, when you submit a port request, if you're having to do that, that's service versus user numbers. You can absolutely allocate numbers that you have bought to the service against either of those two types. If you don't know in advance, you can get Microsoft support to adjust or swap the numbers over behind the scenes, but it's worth having a guess. If you know what a mainline reception number is going to be, for example, tell them that that's a service number at the point that you port it. The reason being that as soon as the porting request is accepted by Microsoft, they will allocate those numbers and make them available in your tenant, and you can start allocating them to your users, which means your users can start making outbound calls from the Teams platform using their allocated DDI before the numbers are actually available. Obviously, incoming calls will still route to the old system. But if you need to swap a number from a service to a user number, Microsoft has to remove all of them from your tenant and reapply them. Not a big deal if you're using scripts and stuff to do that number allocation, but just something to be aware of. So the next one to talk about is direct routing. Direct routing, the primary reason that you would want to go for direct routing is it offers you flexibility. And in terms of flexibility, it gives you choices for who the carrier is that you're using to provide telephony services, what type of gateways you're going to use, gives you a lot better choices of integration, with any existing on-prem services that have to stay behind, and you can choose how you are going to deliver those telephony services. If I just skip back for a second here, and hopefully I can do a little spotlight on the screen. The idea with direct routing is you have a gateway that you deploy inside your environment somewhere. And when I say inside your environment, that's not necessarily true. You can take direct routing from hosted providers. You can run these gateways in Azure or other cloud services platforms if you want to. But the idea is that you have a gateway somewhere that is hooked up to a PSTN service of some kind. So that could be existing ISDN circuits that you have. It could be SIP trunks to a provider or SIP trunks to multiple providers. And you configure that gateway to set up an encrypted SIP trunk to Office 365. And you then assign, instead of a calling plan to your users, they have to have the phone system, same as the calling plan users do. And then you assign a phone number and what's called a voice routing policy. So when a user who has a number assigned to them and a voice route makes a phone call, talks to Office 365 service, the team service, which then directs the call to a particular gateway, which then, according to its routing rules, sends that call further upstream. So carrier choices. One of the reasons you might want to go for direct routing is perhaps you have existing contracts with providers that are ongoing for multiple years, or perhaps you have multiple carriers. We saw from the country list for calling plans that the coverage from Microsoft very much depends on your geographical region. So direct routing is how you are able to provide numbers or telephony services into Teams for regions that Microsoft don't. So you are able to essentially kind of mix and match your own coverage as you want, depending on your requirements. You can also absolutely mix and match between calling plans themselves and direct routing. So you can have some users in your tenant in the UK, for example, on direct routing, on calling plans, and you can have other users, say in South Africa or Australia or wherever else, who are using direct routing. There's no compatibility issues, or there's no kind of one size fits all for your tenant. You can mix and match these things. From a gateway point of view, Microsoft has a certified list that you can find on their docs website. The main ones being Audio Codes and Ribbon. They have gateways that either physical gateways or virtual gateways, if you want to run them in Azure or AWS, that can be hooked up and are compatible or certified as compatible for the direct routing service. It's very important that they are compatible gateways. That means they've gone through the certification process for Microsoft, and that they can handle kind of the nitty-gritty SIP negotiations that are going to happen there, because you can get into some quite complicated call flows with things like call transfers and refer headers and PSCert identities and all that sort of stuff. So going for a gateway from a certified vendor and a firmware version that has been certified means that those compatibility issues are hopefully going to be non-existent. In terms of choosing a vendor for gateways, if you don't have anything at the moment, each of them offer their own kind of extras, if you like, with things around smart call routing or smart failover. So one of the things when you're looking into direct routing, if you're going to run your own service as opposed to taking it from a provider or a hosted partner, is to consider things like what sort of geographical redundancy you might need, whether you have to maintain calls at all costs, or whether you can allow existing calls to drop if a particular item of equipment fails, and how you want to reroute calls, whether you do that manually or whether you want it all to be automated. Another thing to consider is the different SBC gateways or vendors have their own types of licensing for the amount of SIP calls that they're doing. Some of the providers will allow you to do things like roving licensing, for example. So if you had a global deployment and you had a follow the sun requirement for where your licensing increased during the working day and dropped off during the evening, then you can kind of have a fixed number of licenses across your entire global deployment, and they follow the usage around the world, as opposed to having to have a fixed number of capacity to hit peak at every single location. So again, there's a few things to think about there. From an integration point of view, there's no question if you have your own gateway, that's going to give you the best compatibility for any equipment or anything that you have on site that you need to hook into. So it might be that you have ISDN circuits, and SBC will sit and talk to those ISDN circuits and allow you to even pass through to the PBX if you want to while you're doing migration. until such point as you want to turn the PBX off, or it's only there supporting services that aren't able to be migrated to Teams. The other thing the SBCs can do, they generally can have FXS or FXO ports to support analog devices. Some of them allow you to direct register SIP handsets against them. Again, if you've got particular calling scenarios where it doesn't make sense to have a Teams device or a Teams phone deployed in there. And you've got control as well, so you can see across the environment of SBCs that you've got, what your calling load is like. You can see what the quality is like. You can, divert calls around your network as you want to. Whereas in the calling plans version, you're outsourcing all of that to Microsoft if you like. You can through CQD, same as you can with direct routing, get a feel for call quality and metrics, but you can't kind of see calls through the system in the same way that you can in direct routing. In terms of delivery method, I think I've alluded to this a couple of times. You can either go self-hosted, so that is you buy the gateways yourself, you put them in your data center, or you put them in branch, depending on what the requirement for direct routing is, and you look after them yourselves, or you run them out of Azure yourselves. And there's no reason you can't do that and talk to SIP providers and get them to deliver SIP trunks into Azure or AWS, or you can go partner hosted. So we offer this as a service. Quite a lot of the carriers that we work with have their own direct routing platform offerings as well. And again, if you're looking for going with a partner or someone who provides this, the sort of things to look for are coverage and call costs and what have you. And again, you can mix and match. So the same way you can have calling plans alongside direct routing, you can absolutely have direct routing in any flavor that you like from as many partners as you like to give you the custom kind of solution that you need for your business and the locations you have to provide coverage. So lastly, just briefly talking about approach. In terms of approach to these things, you need to go and have a look at how many users you've got in different locations and find out as much as you can about what they do day to day with telephony and calling. So, I know some organizations have been going through and questioning the facts, do users actually need to have DDIs anymore? Is it something that we need to do, given that everyone has a company mobile? If people are making phone calls, do they absolutely have to have the ability to make international calls? Maybe they're actually making such a low volume of international calls that it doesn't make sense to give them an international calling plan. There's another licensing type called consumption credits, which is essentially a pay-as-you-go pot that you can assign against your tenant. So users where they make international calls infrequently can do that on a pay-as-you-go basis. What sort of numbers do we need to port? What sort of other services do we have to maintain if we've migrated or ported numbers away to a different service? So, there's a whole bunch of information there that the more you know about the location and the users that you're trying to provide telephony services to, the better it helps kind of shape what you need to do. There's a pilot phase, so that would be, checking, and there's two elements here. There's one is checking that the technical aspects are right. So if you're going for direct routing, is the carrier you're working with delivering the trunk correctly? Can you transfer calls around the network properly? Can you support users in the way that you need? And then the second part of it is making sure that when you've got telephony enabled for your users or for a user, does that operate the way that you want it to? Are the devices in the meeting rooms compatible? Do they work correctly? So there's kind of two sides to piloting. It's the technical aspect of making sure everything is working as it's supposed to, but then this kind of softer, what's the user experience? What's the actual process for migration that we need to follow for your particular devices and your particular scenario? Then the migration phase is when you actually do the migration, and that might be if you're porting numbers, that you submit the port request early during your pilot phase, you get a date, you can adjust it if you need to. And then migration is when you're actually, hitting the ground, reconfiguring meeting room phones or devices or giving users headsets, all that sort of stuff as you need to. And then lastly is review. Review is you don't, or you shouldn't just kind of walk away after you've done a migration, because Teams is doing all this stuff over the IP network, regardless of whether that's breaking out on a gateway in your environment or calling plans on the Microsoft side. or somewhere hosted, you need to be making sure that the experience is as you expected it to be for your users. You know, is your network quality good enough? Is it sustaining the level of experience that you would expect? Are people not using the service as much as they should? Are people using the service more than they were before because it's now more convenient for them to do so? So there's this kind of cycle that when the project is finished, you need to make sure you're trying to kind of stay on top of any issues or anything developing that might impact user quality further on down the line. So sorts of stuff that we can help with, you know, should it be required, is Teams telephony options, you know, helping pick those two apart between calling plans and direct routing, trying to understand which is more appropriate for a particular scenario. But also we do have the capability of providing test numbers via a direct routing platform that we run ourselves. So again, that's absolutely something we can help with if anyone wants to kind of dip their toes in here. And it is very straightforward if you've got users who are in Teams to just assign the licenses, spin up direct routing. It's you know, some PowerShell commands to make it all work. But don't be deceived. That does mean, you know, doesn't mean that there is an effort there to again ensure things like network device compatibility, headsets, that sort of stuff. So there is still process to go through. But if you just want to get a feel for how it works, how it behaves, what the actual user experience is like, it is relatively straightforward to get that sort of stuff lit up and underway. So I think with 4 minutes to go, that's the conclusion of what I had today. I think there's the option to ask some questions that we can go into in a minute. But I'll just leave up here that the next one of these in our series is on March 25th. And that's talking about our One Meeting solution. So the One Meeting is a software product that we have that allows multiple kind of non-Teams devices to still join and integrate with a Teams meeting that's ongoing. So thank you very much.